Okay, great. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. Welcome in person. Welcome to anyone joining online as well. My name is Harry Brigazzi. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Government Outcomes Lab here in the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. And it's my great pleasure to be chairing today's discussion, the title of which is Pursuing Better Social Outcomes in Fragile and Conflict-Affected States. So, across the conference as a whole, cross-sector partnership in the pursuit of better outcomes is the broad theme. We talk a lot about outcomes contracting, and in this session, we're taking that theme, but thinking about the specific contextual difficulties of working in what we call fragile states or conflict-affected states to adopt that quite common categorization. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping notes. So we're a hybrid conference with the people online and in the room. If you're in the room, feel free to join the Zoom call as well if you want to post in the chat, so you can find the link on the program. But please keep your speakers muted if you do so we don't have audio problems in the room. And we'll have plenty of time for questions both in person and online. So one of my colleagues will be gathering questions from the Zoom chat as we go. And we'll come to both online and in person. To be clear for everyone, the session's being recorded and is going to be publicly available online afterwards as well. And joining me, I've got three GoLab colleagues here. So we've got Eve, Juliana, and Mateus in a row here. And if you have any trouble during the session, you can go to one of those. They should be able to help you out, and they'll be helping field the questions too. So turning to the topic then, so fragility we know is a broad concept. We know states can be fragile for different reasons. There are multiple indexes that try to categorize and rank which states they consider to be more fragile or less fragile. And a deep dive into the meaning of fragility and assessment of these methods isn't really our purpose for today, but it is worth saying that when you look up definitions of state fragility, typically, the definition will cite characteristics such as contested governmental legitimacy, often the presence of intergroup conflict, the loss of the state's control and the monopoly of violence, for example, and an inability to perform state functions. And for these reasons, a common characteristic is inadequate or unevenly distributed service provision. And it's this matter of service provision in particular that we'll be discussing with our panel today. Because of the domestic state's lack of capacity to deliver services, the service system often involves many external agencies, NGOs, aid agencies, multilateral governmental organizations, and so on. So the service system consists of partnerships between internal and external, state and non-state, local and national organizations, who are working together trying to better meet the needs of the citizens under often very difficult circumstances. So the overarching question that's going to guide our discussion today is, what makes for an effective service partnership in contexts that are by definition high risk and subject to instability? And by effective, we mean able to evidence measurable improvements in the lives of service users. So I'm joined by the panelists here to discuss this. So first we have Diva Samad on my immediate left, who is a senior health system specialist at the Global Fund and formerly was a deputy minister in Afghanistan's Ministry of Public Health. And Diva is joined by two colleagues who may or may not be online yet, but may be joining at some point. Benjamin Levinson, who is Director of Immunization Financing and Sustainability at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and Bashir Hamid, who is Senior Specialist in Private Sector Service Delivery, also at the Global Fund. And the three of them have worked together in their assessment of delivery of health in Afghanistan, and Doctors Levinson and Hamid both have decades of experience of working in fragile states more generally as well. Next, we have Jalil Hasboun, who is Executive Director of Finance for Jobs Consultant Services, and he is responsible for running career training and employment for young people in Palestine, which is where he's traveled from to join us today. And finally, on the far left of the panel, Louise Saville, who is a director at Social Finance. She works in the international development side of social finance's work, and they're an organization that's been involved in many forms of social outcomes contracting in particular, including in fragile states, including, in fact, in the Palestinian case study that Jalil will be telling us about. On the program, Simon Meldrum from the International Federation of the Red Cross was meant to be speaking as well. Unfortunately, at the last moment, he's unable to join us, but sends his apologies. So we'll go straight ahead with two presentations first from Diva and Jalil. Then we'll have a discussant's response from Louise, some chit chat amongst the panel, and then we shall open up to hopefully about half an hour of questions from the audience. So we've got plenty of time for discussion, and let's hope for an excellent discussion. So without further ado, I can pass straight over to Diva, who can tell us about the delivery of health in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Harry, and it's nice meeting you all. Good afternoon. In this session, I know the time is limited, so I'm gonna have a focused discussion, but I'm happy to meet everyone, chat separately after the session as well, in case you have any question on the presentation. So the presentation is really focused on our experience of health service delivery in the context of Afghanistan, which was really a contract out approach of service delivery with civil society organization, mostly local NGOs, to deliver primary healthcare. Next slide, please. There are a few key messages from our experience. First, the contracting in Afghanistan was very large scale. It covered around 30 million population. The experience was also very long-term. It has been running for over 20 years now, and it's still going on. The results based on evaluations are quite impressive, despite very harsh security situations in the country. The incorporation of pay for performance into service delivery contracts of NGOs has further strengthened contracting in Afghanistan, and we have done an evaluation that has shown that P4P has increased service coverage by about 21 percentage point over less than 3 years. Some of the lessons that we learned from this large-scale implementation of service delivery to NGOs are, first of all, it's very important that we are clear about service package, and it has to be prioritized. That really defines measures of success for health in the country. It's also important to provide autonomy to non-governmental organizations, especially when government decides to contract out. It's good that we give that needed autonomy for service providers to adjust their service delivery based on the ground realities. It's important that we not only do contract management, but also performance management for this to work. It's also the fourth important lesson for us was it's important that we make sure that contract packages are large enough to capture economies of scale rather than going for fragmented contracting approach. Next slide, please. So in this today's presentation, I will speak briefly about the context of Afghanistan, some of the major health system reforms that were undertaken in the last 20 years, and also maybe a little bit of brief focus on how the P4P approach worked in the country. Next. This is the baseline period of Afghanistan, which was right before we started contracting out in this way, which is 2002. Afghanistan was an extremely poor country. Female literacy rate was very low at that time. Health outcomes were terrible. 1 in every 4 children wouldn't make it to their 5th birthday. And maternal mortality was one of the highest in the country as well. Health workforce capacity almost did not existed. In the Ministry of Health, we just had a name, but it did not have the capacity to oversight service delivery. Humanitarian NGOs existed in the country, but they were operating very scatteredly across country. And also they were focused on managing individual facilities, not focused on population. Next slide, please. We have highlighted 4 major health system reforms that were undertaken in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. First was after the fall of the Taliban regime, a new government was set up with the support of the international community. So health sector took this opportunity to really set up a priority package of population-based health services that were focused on PHC in the country. And also we decided to adopt a contract out strategy to leverage the semi-capacity that humanitarian and NGOs had at that time in Afghanistan to do it more systematically. Donors supported this approach with separate financing mechanism. The package was the same, but different donors covered different provinces to support this package. From 2015 to 2018, after 10 years of learning, we learned that we need to expand services much more, and we needed to look for efficiency gains. And together with donors, we pooled financing into one national health project that we call it SAHAT, with one accountability framework to reduce fragmentation. In 2019 to 2021, again, we did another evaluation to see what can be improved. We decided to focus and transform service delivery contract from its input focus towards more output. That's when we adopted pay for performance contracting, and the project is called Sahat Mandi in the context of Afghanistan. In 2021, unfortunately, Taliban returned to Afghanistan. And there were a lot of fears around how health services will be delivered, especially that funding stopped for Afghanistan. But the fact that we had a model of contracting in place in Afghanistan, international community was still able to fund health services to Afghans even until today. And next slide, please. So this is basically the slide tells us about the resilience of contracting with NGOs. You can see how under 5 mortality rate has declined over time in Afghanistan, despite increasing conflict that's captured in battlefield deaths from Apsala database that has continuously increased in the country. Next slide, please. It's the same applies to coverage of basic services that was the focus of the package that we prioritize. If you look into the data for DPT3, skilled bird attendance rate, or ANC visits in the country, it has continuously improved despite a rise of conflict over time in the country. And next slide. So basically, these are some of the policy reforms that were undertaken. I spoke about it before as well. I'll briefly touch it. It's important to have we understood that it was important to have a standardized package of services. The focus was on basic package of health services, and secondary hospital services were captured under this program. It was also important that we focus on government stewardship role. So this contracting did not take place outside government. It was embedded within the Ministry of Health structure as a unit of government contract management unit. We make sure that contracts are competitive, and that's how over time a lot of local CSOs, they became eligible to be part of the process as well. We invested thoroughly on monitoring and evaluation. Afghanistan has rich data compared to our regional countries, and also in terms of innovation, we encourage both supply and demand side innovations for increasing coverage. Next slide. So these are some of the technical elements of the contracting. Contracts were selected competitively based on quality and cost-based selection. The Ministry of Public Health defined package of services, but we also tried to define geography, because we wanted to look into health outcomes at the population level. So in the context of Afghanistan, one NGO was responsible for one province. Contracts were managed by the Ministry of Public Health, and it had clear objectives that were being continuously assessed by third-party monitoring. The contracts had a very significant lump sum portion, so it allows NGOs to be flexible and adjust their inputs in a way that they see fit. Similarly, initially we started with a lot of INGOs or international NGOs delivering services, but over the last 20 years, more than 70% of these contracts are owned by local NGOs in Afghanistan. Next slide, please. So this is basically a little bit of more details on how we adopted pay for performance approach in Afghanistan, which is defined in the context of 3 schemes. One is Sahat project, where it was before we started pay for performance contracting. It was more input-based contracting. The other one is Sahat Mandi, which is the 3 to 4 years where Afghanistan shifted to more performance-based contracting. And it's controlled provinces. These are 3 provinces where government was delivering services, not NGOs, and there was no linkages to performance. So the key difference between the first and second scheme is they all deliver the same package of health services. Over time, we combined it, but it's about how we paid it. In Fahad, only 20% of contract value was linked to a performance, but that was really much focused on inputs. But in Sahat Mandi, up to 60% of the contract value was linked to output level indicators that were proxy indicators for health outcomes. And under the Ministry of Health Finance government, we were not able to start pay for performance given its modality. Next slide, please. So this is basically how P4P worked. We set tariffs for each indicators that were prioritized, and we would evaluate it every 6 months based on the third-party monitoring reports, and we will calculate the payment based on the consistency of actual reports of HMIS and how much would the third party verify it. Next slide, please. So basically, over time, we learned that pay for performance or P4P contracting in Afghanistan showed that greater than 90% consistency and accuracy in reporting in pay for performance provinces compared to other provinces. It really encouraged providers to focus on results. You can see it in the graph that it was the highest in contracted provinces with P4P, which is around 96%, compared to just 89% in the baseline period. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this is basically the results of a P4P approach in the country over the time of its implementation. If you compare it with the baseline period, you can see how, and these are the indicators that were prioritized as part of the pay for performance contracting in Afghanistan. You can see that many of these indicators have seen significant coverage, especially CYP, family planning, which was a very lagging indicator in the country. We saw a significant increase. Most of these were RMNCH related services that were lagging, but we saw all of them being increased significantly in short span of time. Next slide, please. And this is just one example of ANC visits in contracted provinces compared to the non-contracted provinces. You can see that with the start of pay for performance contracting, the results started to scale up, and it was even adjusted during COVID-19. We were still in a trajectory where it was continuously increasing. Next slide. And it's the same for a couple of years of protection. The proxy indicator for family planning, we saw a significant surge in it when pay for performance contracting started. I hope I didn't take more than 10 minutes because I need 2 of my colleagues to speak as well. Over to you, Benjamin and Bashir.
Bashir, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Diva. Good afternoon or good morning, colleagues there. I don't want to take much time, just wanted to emphasize on one of the points that Diva mentioned about the role of NGOs and specifically on the concerns that a lot of our international colleagues and donors, they had at the beginning when they started this contracting about the existing of NGOs, especially local NGOs. There were 1 or 2 local NGOs at that time in Afghanistan and a bunch of maybe few international NGOs. And there was this concern that how this contracting will shape if there are no participants. And the experience showed that a lot of local capacities were there, and they started to respond to this market demand, created several national or local NGOs, I think with a good capacity in the competition with a lot of international NGOs. Now, majority of those contracts are managed and delivered by those local NGOs. As I was one of those people first that started to establish a local NGO at that time and separate from the international NGO who didn't participate in that contracting. So I would be happy to discuss further if there are any questions on this regard. But for the moment, I just stop and hand it over to Benjamin for.
Thanks, Bashir, and thanks, Diwa. So, my perspective on this is that of a donor. I was working for the World Bank during the period of Sehat and Sehat Mandi. And I guess there are a few things that sort of stand out to me. One is the importance of contracting in terms of the stewardship role of government, that I actually think it helped government focus on those things that it was uniquely qualified to do, and actually sort of gave to NGOs those things that governments are not very good at, like making sure that drugs get to the front lines, et cetera. And so governments manage the contracts, set the contracts, and evaluated performance. And so there was really this sort of focus on results. Another thing that strikes me is just the importance of the third-party monitor. I think it was incredibly important to ensure that the results were credible. I think with any pay-for-performance scheme, there's really an invitation to cheat or exaggerate results, and having an independent body that can verify the results is really important. It also levels the playing field between government and NGOs, and therefore provides a useful way of making sure that the focus is on results, and that results are accepted by all parties. And another thing that I think was important is that the third-party monitor was not that expensive. In the context of Afghanistan, the work of the third-party monitor was roughly half of 1% of the cost of the contracts, so not that expensive. So thanks very much.
Perfect. Do you need to come in again? Or?
I think we're done. Maybe we can ask for questions later.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, that's great. So thanks so much, Diva, and thank you to Benjamin and Bashir as well. And do indeed stay on the line, Benjamin and Bashir, and join in the conversation when we get to the discussion portion. So we'll go straight on to Jalil Hasboon's presentation now, who, as I mentioned, is running a service supporting Palestinian youth into employment. And I guess, like Sehat Mandi, the partnership is structured around the achievement of key indicators, key metrics, but maybe with one difference, at least being the addition of the private investment as one of the partners as well. So yet another partner from another sector involved too. So I'll pass straight over to you, Julian.
Thank you, Harry. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm the Director of Finance for Jobs Consulting Services. It's a special purpose vehicle that implements the Finance for Jobs Youth Employment Impact Bond targeting Palestinian youth. Next, please. So we basically track and target sustained youth employment through providing services, employment services, skills training, life skills, technical skills, internships, job placement, and in-work support. And we are the first and only results-based program in Palestine with independently verified results. Next, please. Before going into the details of the presentation, I want just to explain who we are. So our company represents 4 investors: the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Palestinian Investment Fund, FMO, the Entrepreneurial Development Bank, and Semilla de Olivo, which is a Palestinian diaspora fund based in Chile. All of these investors pooled their funding into a private sector company, which I'm managing, and we provide working capital and performance management to local service providers who are on the front line providing the training and job placement services. And they are usually a mixture of universities, industrial unions, chambers of commerce, and so on. We provide these services, we submit them for independent verification, and in our case, it is Deloitte & Touche, one of the big 4 auditing firms. And if we're successful, we are paid for success by a project called Finance for Jobs. So it's basically a World Bank funded project, that is our outcomes funder, giving money to the Palestinian Ministry of Finance with advisory support from DAI Global. It's a complex structure, but at the heart of it, it's very simple. It's a results-based employment program. And the design and advisory services were provided by social finance. Next slide, please. So why are we here? Why are we presenting in the fragile context session? Basically, the occupied Palestinian territories and its population are in two major locations, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. And I will try to demystify the issue about Palestine. The Palestinian population suffers high cost of living, poverty, political instability, and various socioeconomic challenges, including military incursions and town blockades. And we are heavily dependent on donor funding. In 2008, in relation to GDP, 27% was donor funding. And this has been declining for the past 15 years, and it's no longer above 1 or 2%. So there is a public push for accountability for these results. Next slide, please. What you have seen in the previous slide was the separation wall. And Palestine is almost like a Swiss cheese state. It has no geographical connectivity. The West Bank is split into area A, B, and C. And this is according to the temporary 1995 Oslo Accords, which are no longer temporary. Yesterday, by coincidence, was the 30th anniversary of the first Oslo Agreement. So Area A is under Palestinian control, Area B under joint control with the Israelis, and Area C is under Israeli control. All three areas are under Israeli military occupation and surrounded by the separation wall, which you have seen, and hampered movement with checkpoints. The challenge is Area C is over 60% of the West Bank, and its population doesn't have services access to services like health and education services. So they have to rely on employment in Israeli settlements. Next, please. Gaza is a completely different and challenging story. So we have two local governing authorities, one in the West Bank and then one in Gaza. And we don't have control over the economy, the tax revenues, the borders, and Gaza itself has been under blockade for the past, since 2005. So the Gaza population is extremely impoverished, with very, very high population density. With less than 360 square kilometers, they house 40% of the Palestinian population. Next, please. Now, what makes the Palestinian setting so challenging is that it's an informal economy. Over 65% of employment is without any documentation, without any contracts, paid in cash. Unemployment is really high for educated youth. The more educated you are, the worse it is. And it takes on average 18 months for a youth to find a job if they do so. And over 40% of employed Palestinians don't even earn the minimum wage, especially in Gaza, with 90% of those don't earning the minimum wage. And if you are a Gazan youth, then you're most probably unemployed. Next slide, please. Now, what makes things even more challenging is that due to the geographical proximity to Israel, the employment in Israel has been steadily going up for the past 15 or 20 years. 17% of all employment is now, Palestinian employment is now in Israel, about 200,000 people, which is a two-edged sword. It's good for income for those employed, but it's a very hampering blockade to the growth of Palestinian private sector. Next, please. Now, if you are a woman and you are educated and you are in Gaza, definitely you are unemployed. Females have less than 17% labor force participation, although they are at 65% in terms of enrollment. So we have very, very high female education enrollment, but very low employment. So we're not able to translate education for females into employment. And females suffer double the employment of men, especially in Gaza. Next slide, please. So in response, we have designed the Finance for Jobs Impact Bond. It targets, and these are, just to be clear, these are Palestinian scale numbers. So it's a proof of concept project. It targets around 1,300 Palestinian youth with a target of 30% female participation. We worked through 9 local service providers, and the contract size was 5 million at the beginning. And we were supposed to launch in early 2020, but unfortunately COVID hit. Next slide, please. And because we are a skills development program and most of our training is physical, that was a serious challenge. But our COVID response was successful. We prioritized 2 health projects, one in nursing, employment of nurses and employment of doctors. And we were able to launch 2 or 3 months after the pandemic hit. We moved online, and we were lucky we had an almost ready online centralized data system. So that allowed us to move online fairly quickly. And I'm happy to say we have been fairly successful, and the contract size has been increased twice to reach 6.25 million, and we have been extended. And I'll tell you why. Next slide, please. So this is why we have been successful. The payments to the investors and to the special purpose vehicle have been tied very, very closely to results. For youth, on our program, we get paid certain tariffs, and less than 20% of those tariffs are for training. So it's heavily weighted towards employment outcomes, and the highest is towards the 6-month sustainment, the ultimate outcome we are after, and what our outcomes funders are after. Now, this is from the youth journey perspective per tariff. On the aggregate, even if we manage to train people profitably, we can only make less than 40% of the total contract size. So we can make up to 2.3 million only, which means we have to put people in jobs by design. And we get paid 15% premium for female employment. Now, the same model of payment from the World Bank, from our outcome funders to the SPV, has been replicated to the service providers, but it was flipped. To shield them from risk of underperformance in terms of employment, we pay them 80% for training outputs. And there is a catch here. They can make those 20% remaining budget if they hire people, and they can make an upside. They can get to 120% if they overperform. And we created interim payments because most of these are NGOs. We had to help and boost their cash flows. So we created interim payments across the youth journey. Next, please. And this is why we have been successful. We have overachieved on our employment targets. Our graduates make 50% above the minimum wage on average, and we have achieved and maintained 40% female employment. And why is this very important and unique? It's because all the jobs are uniquely identified, independently verified. There are no subsidies. So a common practice is to provide subsidies to employers. We cannot do that because we are paid for these jobs. We cannot create them by simply paying the salaries. And we're not counting internships, we're not counting indirect jobs, which is also a common practice in employment programs. Next slide, please. So because of this success, we were able to reach our contract cap, the 6.25 million in April this year. Our social investors are committed and decided to continue to provide services even without being paid for them, without having any revenues for another year until June next year. And they decided to pilot in Gaza. And this pilot is a proof of concept because they are trying to scale the impact bond further. Next slide. One other reason why we have been successful is our portfolio. We didn't invest in one sector or in one job type. We've invested in nurses, employment programs, doctors, ICT jobs, health and safety engineers, education, furniture, so all sorts of education backgrounds and jobs and sectors. Next, please. What have we learned through this journey over the past 3 years? Next, please. You have to localize the impact bond design. They all look the same in design, in theory, but in practice, you have to cater to the needs of the local employers, the local service providers, and so on. So we invested in multiple sectors, multiple job types, as I've shown. And one challenge was that there are no large employment opportunities in Palestine. We had to go after niche opportunities. And when I say niche, it's like training 100 people, chasing after 5 jobs here, 2 jobs there. This is not done at scale. We have to chase after these small jobs because most of the Palestinian employers are not even small, they are micro employers. Next, please. Independent verification is critical. It provides accountability, but in an informal economy, it has to be done properly. You have to understand that employers and youth don't have an interest and no reason to share their employment status. Why would they? Even if you help them find jobs. So we had to work with the youth very closely to convince them to provide this documentation. As I said, local context is heavily dependent on internships. It's a misused approach to employment. You basically pay an intern indefinitely for 6 months, for 9 months, and you heavily pay them. So you're disguising unemployment in internships. What we have done is use internships as a tool to employment. Very short internships as a tool for skills gain and very minimally paid so that employers don't take advantage. If you want this youth, you hire them. It's a skills gain tool. And this is very, very critical. And we don't provide the subsidies, as I said. And our DIB graduates, we have found, are empowered to find their own job. Yes, we do provide job intermediation, but they must find the jobs also on their own. And they are able to move to better jobs, better paying jobs if they want to. There is this theoretical question about what is a good job. Well, it is a job that the youth finds useful for them. It pays them a good salary. Sometimes there is this theoretical discussion about, oh, it's engineering jobs and doctors' jobs. Yes, these are good jobs, but also upholstery making and carpentry jobs are good jobs, especially for women in rural areas. And we're happy that the DIB has started a discussion and kickstarted the DIB market in Palestine and the region. Next slide, please. Now, our investors carry most of the risk, but because our payments to service providers have been also results-based, we have made changes in their culture, in their way of thinking. And the most successful of these service providers have been the small, less bureaucratic service providers, especially if they had a champion, a field person who is there on the ground to respond to employer needs in a very volatile political situation. And finally, group training is not enough. We have to provide case management. We have to cater to the individual. We cannot let the individual disappear in the group setting, especially in the COVID days when the training went online. Next, please. And this is why we're happy that we're negotiating a second DIB with our very dear partners at the World Bank and the Ministry of Finance, but we're trying to make it more ambitious. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jadil. And we'll go to Louise Seville now for some discussant's response to that.
Very much. It's a huge privilege to sit on the panel with you, Diva and Jalil, and to hear about these incredibly inspiring and thought-provoking case studies from the West Bank and Gaza and Afghanistan. So thank you, and thank you, Harry, for inviting me. Now, Harry gets to see a bit more of me, because actually, since I had the privilege of being invited to write a paper ahead of last year's Social Outcomes Conference on how social outcomes contracts and system strengthening might connect, Harry and I have been thinking behind the scenes about what's the relationship? Is there a relationship? Could there be a relationship between outcomes-focused contracting, so this kind of results-based contracting, and what role that could play, particularly in conflict-affected or fragile states? So I'm really privileged to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about some thoughts around that today. And I guess my first observation of this is fairly self-evident, namely that fragile and conflict-afflicted states are not a homogeneous group of countries. I'm stating the obvious, but it is really, really important, because actually defining the nature of fragility and strength within a given country, within a given system, really understanding the characteristics of that context is critically important, considering both how systems might benefit from being strengthened and also the art of the possible. What might it actually be possible to achieve, and over what time period? I think the Afghanistan case study was a hugely interesting example of how, how quickly, but also over what time period, real change maybe needs to embed and to happen. And also, I think Jalil, the West Bank and Gaza example is a really interesting case of how important it is to localize those solutions. So from a review of the literature, kind of pulling a little bit back from the real world, important considerations around that might include things like the nature of the political system. Is it stable? Is it competitive? Norms around public sector decision-making. Are they personal decisions? Are they impersonal decision-making processes? How are decisions taken that might affect a program? And also, to some extent, the nature of the incentives that government actors at all levels are subject to. Are they incentivized to think about outcomes, or are they actually rewarded for following processes? And those kinds of things can be shifted in time, as I think we've seen, but actually culture shifts are always challenging, because we're dealing with human beings, and human beings who have often a vested interest in the status quo continuing. They figured out how to do their job. They don't necessarily want that to change. So to strengthen systems, we must first understand the art of what's possible. And in some cases, we might just hope to make relatively incremental changes. But I think what we've seen today is the incredible power of creating sort of islands of effectiveness, examples of how these kinds of approaches can work in particular contexts. So that was my first thought. My second thought, which might be equally self-evident, so apologies, is that it's important to consider, for whom are we thinking about system strengthening? And I think there's lots of different elements of that. I think it was really exciting, Jalil, to hear you talking about some of the smaller, less bureaucratic nonprofits actually really rising to the challenge of delivering outcomes within these contracts. And actually that resonates with experiences that we've seen in other forms of outcomes-based contracts. But actually, equally important, I think, Diva, was your observation of how important it was to have government front and centre, sitting as part of the contract management, the contracting, and the design kind of process. So I think that's really, really important. And when I thought last year in terms of a conceptual framework about this, and about what might be the pathways by which social outcomes contracts could potentially contribute to system strengthening. And I should caveat that actually one of the purposes of last year's paper was to try to inspire a research agenda around this. Actually, the research on this is relatively thin. What sticks? I'd love to know. Please, researchers in the audience, take this as a call to arms. But we posited two potential pathways. The first spoke to the potential impact on improving public policy and public service design. So essentially demonstrating what can work for a particular sector, be that health, be that employment, be it education. And the second spoke to ways of working and driving improved ways of working. So things like improving contracting, program design, contract management, use of data, governance, cross-sector working, all of these things that feel very unsexy, but are actually often the absolute foundation of what makes the difference between an effective program and a less effective program. But there is nothing inherent about outcomes-based contracts that necessarily leads them to have sort of legacy effects of this kind. And it could be argued, to be my own kind of advocate, play devil's advocate to myself, that actually potentially badly designed or badly managed contracts could have the opposite effect of weakening state capacity. And I think that's something as practitioners that we have to stay alive to. And actually, it was something we heard from Mark and Ben on the panel this morning, actually, which was around how important it is that government has capacity to sort of inspect, regulate, commission good public services. So to the extent that the kind of social outcomes contracts can support policy implementation by harnessing non-state capacity in some ways through the delivery of services, I think it is as important to think about what is really needed on the other side of those contracts in terms of public sector capacity to commission, appropriately contract, and create quite a kind of high trust performance management context. So we're thinking about, when we're talking about delivering better outcomes in fragile states, we are at least at some level thinking about embedding the capacity for achieving better outcomes internally to government institutions. Now, the third piece that I wanted to kind of pick up on was then around what more needs to be put in place then to achieve that broader capacity building, and to ensure that actually programs like this can really leave a legacy that lasts. And how could we think about designing programs from the beginning with that sort of system strengthening legacy in mind? And that legacy could take a whole range of different forms. It could be the development of data systems and ways of interpreting and reading data that ultimately become owned and managed by government beyond the duration of a contract. It could be building off really excellent service delivery practice to build new technical service guidance or policy guidelines and standards around a particular sector or a particular set of services. It could be about embedding evaluation and audit capacity within public sector agencies all beyond. And I think one of the really interesting similarities that came out in both of your presentations actually was the real value of having an independent outcome auditor, outcome verifier, independent of both government and the providers, and the sort of confidence in contracting in this way that having that independent agent as part of the contracts created. So what additional support is needed to wrap around that? And I guess the kind of key questions for me that maybe, Harry, we could open up to the discussion on the panel are, so how do we ensure that programs not only deliver services effectively, but also leave a legacy in terms of strengthened system capacity? What kinds of capacity does it make sense to embed in non-state providers as opposed to state actors? And can we sometimes maybe think about creating pathways between the two? The capacity that maybe builds outside of the state, there are ways to put that in, or vice versa. And then what additional support is needed and where might that support come from? And I'd love to hear the panelists' answers.
You please, if you like.
I think this is a very good question. And I really like what you said about what does capacity mean, and does it only mean that capacity needs to be generated, or the capacity needs to be generated within government only, or broader sector? So the experience of Afghanistan at least tells us that we looked into capacity building across the sector, health sector, starting from government, where there was a very particular focus on strengthening government's capacity to design and manage contract, because that was really essential for us to design it, but also to manage contract. But we also thought that there must be capacity within civil society organizations to deliver services, especially local non-governmental organization in the country that just when we started the work 20 years ago, there were only a few of them. But eventually, through partnership, we were able to scale that capacity within local context of Afghanistan through rigorous competition. So they could scale the cost of service delivery in a more innovative way. But it's also about capacity building in terms of what delivers optimum results. If I give you a brief example of, for example, health, this education sector in Afghanistan. Health sector was managed mostly in partnership with non-governmental organizations, but education sector was managed by government itself. There was a dominant focus that it has to be government. All the capacity needs to be concentrated within the government. If you look into the outcome today, sadly, education outcomes in Afghanistan is one of the worst in the world. But in health sector, we were able to train thousands of midwives through this partnership that are delivering services as bombs were being thrown in the country. That capacity existed. If a deputy minister or a minister would no longer serve, the health facilities were still functional. So I think in fragile settings, we have to see the capacity more holistically to really make sure that it's not only government, but it's sector-wide. And within government, as I mentioned before too, when we moved to pay for performance contracting specifically, I was in the Ministry of Health. And the focus for me was like, how can we strengthening the stewardship role, not to have that control role, but it was to more of having the facilitator role. I wanted the ministry to focus on data, on results. It was for the first time that Ministry of Health, different departments would look into HMIS reports, just because system was designed in a way where payments were made based on results. So that would be from my side. I don't know if my colleagues want to add anything, or maybe over to Jalil, if you want to add anything.
Thank you, Diva. So to answer your question, I think we ought to understand that we're speaking about government, right? And we're speaking about building capacity. Where does a project sit in a government will possibly have an effect on how it is approached. In our case, it's an employment project sitting within the Ministry of Finance. One could argue it is a Ministry of Labor project. If it's within the Ministry of Labor, it will be purely technical employment project. If it's sitting within the Ministry of Finance, it is a financial product, and they're looking at how to, fund it, finance it, contract it. And we heard in the morning about the procurement side of things. So I think in order to build the capacity, we must have the government, not just the ministry, not just a line ministry, involved, and not just in the procurement. The procurement is one element that we have focused on really greatly this morning, but there must be a co-design phase. The government needs to understand what they are procuring, what the end results are. The secret herbs, that were discussed this morning are really secret to the government. They must be involved, and they need to be a part of the co-design. In our case, and possibly to some extent in Afghanistan, it is, for example, funded by donors because it's a fragile context. It's the donor money, like the World Bank, going as a grant to the Ministry of Finance in our case. And it is their money, even though it's a grant from the World Bank. So I think if they are heavily involved, we're building the capacity where it matters. What we are doing cannot be scaled if we're focused only on the service providers. The service providers are really critical, but at the end of the day, they are a drop in the bucket. The government is the entity that will eventually own all of the services we're making. And if we were to build the capacity at scale and make system change, it has to be done at the government, with the government. We're making changes, but they are still small and too far in between in terms of the system capacity.
Great, thanks. So I want to give Benjamin and Bashir a chance to come in as well. So Louise asked about what kinds of capacity might it make sense to embed within the government or to outsource to non-state actors. And actually, I think, Benjamin, that's exactly what you referred to in your brief comments earlier. And so I don't know if you wanted to elaborate on that, and maybe a response to Louise's follow-up question on the additional support that is needed in order to enable that to happen, I guess, either on the government side and indeed on the non-government side as well.
Sure. So thanks for that. It's a great question and a bit challenging. So I think it's important to understand that at the beginning, in Afghanistan, when we were first starting with the contracting, there was a unit set up in the Ministry of Public Health called the GCMU, the Grants and Contracts Management Unit, and it was basically Afghans, many of them coming from the NGO sector, that were brought into the government. So it was sort of brain gain. Brought in paid market wages, but brought into the government, and they actually helped design and implement the contracting system. It had a couple of advantages. First of all, these people knew the NGO sector. They were physically located in the Ministry of Public Health, and it was relatively cheap to run. So USAID had a separate unit that was, managing the contracts that they were financed, and it was much more, orders of magnitude more expensive to run than the GCMU. And I'd just like to sort of echo what Diwa said about, sort of the capacity building that happened both in government and in the sector more broadly. I mean, there were 10,000 community midwives that were trained over the last 15 years in Afghanistan. And so, I mean, maternal mortality rates have crashed, partly because there's so much availability. So capacity has been built in many ways. And I also think that just getting good results and setting standards really provides a benchmark against which now people, they know that this is what they should expect from their government, that services, should be delivered of a certain quality and quantity. People should show up. There should be drugs in the facilities. They should be treated well, etc. And I think, it's not impossible for it to degrade. It just makes it a little harder. I don't know, Bashir, if you want to come in on this.
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin. Just one point I wanted to add on the capacity building of especially service provider side. I think once we talk about capacity building, it's mainly in some minds comes classroom capacity building or sending people to top universities for some master degree education and all those things. And we did all these in the government and service providers level. But I want to say the most important point from our experiences in Afghanistan was the practical way of doing things. In fact, it is more of this capacity. Let's say it's like skills, like swimming. You have to do to learn, not in the classroom. You cannot learn, as Benjamin always says, and I borrow this from him. So, and for NGOs, especially, they are responsive to the direct, prompt feedback from the government when there is contracting. And especially when these contracts are linked with the measurable outcome and results. So the NGOs will adapt themselves, their systems and their performance based on the feedback they get from the government or the contract manager. And especially this is coming not in a terms of feedback, verbal feedback. Feedbacks can come through the RFP documents, which NGOs they are preferring to go in contract with them, like what are the requirements for NGOs performance or all these, and the performance management reviews that the government did and provided feedback regularly to the NGOs. And those feedbacks were in fact affecting their future contracting. So it was very materialistic or very outcome-based feedback also. One example was the HMIS data. There was a lot of discussion about the quality of those data, and a lot of efforts was done to make those data useful for the government, for the partners. But the important step was that link that data with their payments. So the NGOs, once they realize that the data they're reporting is verified by a third-party monitor, and then it links with their payments, then everything became very serious. Their reaction was to improve the quality of data rapidly. And I think just wanted to say that to summarize, the capacity building or capacity improvement in the service provider side were mainly kind of adjusting and adapting to the way that the contracts are managed by the government, the feedback are provided, and it's more practical. Thank you.
Thanks, Bashir. Thanks, Benjamin, too. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add, Louise, anything to come back on there, or?
No, I mean, I think it's really, I fully agree with everything that's been said, actually. I think that it's really important to think about system strengthening or capacity building at so many different levels, all the way from the kind of people on the front line delivering the services, all the way up to these kinds of changes in cultural practice around the more technical things, the contracting, the data management that Bashir and Benjamin were referring to. So I think really important points, and important points about the fact that this isn't about learning on paper. And in fact, actually, Jalil, there's an analog there with the program that you've been running, I think, which is saying, training on paper is one thing, but actually it doesn't count for much if it doesn't change anything, if it's not getting people into employment or it's not changing the way people are working. And actually really let's keep focused on why we're providing the training. And I think that's a nice kind of analog to that work.
Sure, great, thanks. So we will open to questions in a moment. So please, if they're in the chat, then for online people, we can pick them up, or you can raise your hands in the room. Before we do, since we've been touching on the support for government that might be required as part of the longer term legacy of some of these programs, I don't want to get you in trouble by getting into politics, Jalil, but based on what you were saying, what is perhaps distinctive for one of the aspects that's distinctive for Palestine is that I understand Gaza and the West Bank have two separate governments. They're not under the same government. So with your expansion of the program into the West Bank, is this beginning with a totally new partnership? I mean, what's the kind of the World Bank's reaction to working then with a new government?
Thank you. Good question. So in the first project that we are implementing, this is a pilot, a proof of concept, yet again, but it's second layer, which is in Gaza. All partners are excited, the World Bank, the investors, the service providers. So when we decided to go to Gaza earlier this year, it has been not just welcomed, it has been requested. So we're doing this pilot as a proof of concept. Now, it's not yet at scale, and we are trying to work directly with employers, and it's the same service providers who have presence in Gaza. Now, if we do it at scale in the future project, then we have to answer that question when we get there. But both authorities in the West Bank and Gaza welcome these services. So they are not against local service providers, because we're a private Palestinian company at the end of the day. Yes, our funding is coming from the World Bank, and our investors are international Palestinian investors. But we're a private sector company that can and will operate in Gaza. So both governing authorities welcome these services. It is very much needed in Gaza. And what I should say, Gaza population and the Gaza youth are very, very committed. So the minute we announce, we have thousands of applications. You could think of these services as a lifeline for youth in Gaza. So we have very high commitment. Now the challenge is to translate that commitment from Palestinian youth to jobs. So we'll see about that very soon.
Okay, do we have any questions in the room then? So one straight away over here, the microphone's going to be coming around.
Hi, first of all, thanks for a great session. I'm
introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, I'm Sarah, and I work at the International Committee of the Red Cross, so in a humanitarian setting and in particular in conflict-affected countries. I was wondering if I'd be interested to hear how you worked with international donors, outcome funders, investors, and how you managed their concerns over risk in those settings. In our projects, we might be speaking sometimes to an interested potential partner interested in the project, and when we give the country or the geography, there's a kind of and silence. And did you face similar challenges, and how did you manage these partners' concerns over concerns or perhaps misperceptions over risk?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. In the context of Afghanistan, but what you mentioned was very valid, because of risk management was a key, especially that more than 70% of the provinces were in conflict. So it was really difficult for funders to finance, but at the same time, setting up joint platforms that we did in the context of Afghanistan, where donors wouldn't just invest in a separate project, but in one project like we did, where we pooled funding and where everybody shared risk, was something that was very helpful. Like World Bank, USAID, Canadians, European Union, and all, they were brought into one platform. We discuss risk continuously, but also joint approaches for risk mitigation, more consistent monitoring and evaluation with the government, but also some donors had separate verification mechanism as well. That was quite helpful. But for projects that would start really small, not at scale, in these setups, the transaction cost is much higher than the outcome that you're looking for. So that's why the example of Saat Mandi, when I mentioned it at the beginning of the project, that running things at scale in partnership is something that is important in conflict affected settings. Yeah, I hope I responded to the question.
Yeah, thanks. Jalil, would you have anything on attitudes to risk as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The project is very famous for being notoriously delayed in launching. So it took at least 3 or 4 years in design, just because of what you're talking about. It's too many partners who are not familiar with this. The World Bank has done a lot to allow for direct contracting of investors. Speaking of procurement, you know, it's a grant from the World Bank, the Ministry of Finance, through project implementation advisory of DAI Global. So it's 3 partners who want to make sure, as outcome funders, that they are getting value for money. And it took us 3 years of negotiations to make sure they are able to do this kind of direct procurement, because it wasn't competed. On the other hand, you have 4 investors, 2 Palestinian and 2 international, who had to go through a lot of discussions on how to set up a special purpose vehicle to be able to receive Palestinian money and international European money. And it is not a financial risk to them, although it is, obviously, but it's reputational. It's a proof of concept. And for some of our investors who are as large as EBRD, this proof of concept cannot fail, because it will have a disastrous effect on impact bonds and pay for results. I mean, Palestine gets a lot of attention in terms of in the development world. So if their proof of concept first project ever for the EBRD fails, and it's the first impact bond for the World Bank, then the results are disastrous. So it was a reputational risk, I think, and this is why we only launched in early 2020. We were supposed to launch 2 years earlier.
There's a question online regarding risk as well, though in a different area. So Federica Grazzi has asked, I'd like to ask if they ever faced risks of arrears, especially with government and leadership changes, and if so, how they mitigated these.
For the context of Afghanistan, as I presented, it was 20 years of experience, so at least 4 or 5 governments changed. There were a lot of elections, but the system continued to work. And because the way the program was designed, it was not around individuals, it was around institutions. And those linkages across institutions were very clearly defined in SOP. And most recently, I personally was not really sure with the Taliban takeover that this will continue. But even with the Taliban takeover, the system was placed in a way that they could not override it. So it is still continuing. So that's what we learned from Afghanistan, that it needs to be institutional.
Fascinating as an example of the resilience, right, in terms of contexts that are subject to shock. That was about as shocking a shock as you could have got, and still the program was able to continue in a certain form. Jalil, did you have anything?
Very quickly, just to say that there hasn't been any significant changes, but because it's a World Bank agreement with the Ministry of Finance, so there is inherent stability in the setting. And this is it was one of the reasons why the investors agreed to take that risk and enter the project.
So there was a question here. I saw a hand raised, and then there's a couple over there too. You still would like to?
Hi, good afternoon. I think it's on. My name is Maarten. I'm working for Amref Health Africa, health organization in mainly East Africa. And I'm actually continuing on the previous question on that risk, and it had to do with the fact that I was intrigued by your breakdown, Jalil, between the 20% on the results that you can control, the whole course, and the 80% that lies in the hands of employers and the situation, and it dives in the fact that it's with all respect, a small scale. And maybe first, I don't know, the previous experience, Diwa was talking about 20 years experience. So how did you, agree upon this cost, this result division or your income division between 20 and 80%? And based on what kind of information did you take that bet more or less as a company?
I think it has to do with the very strong due diligence that has been done of the market. It is all about setting realistic and achievable results. If the results are too easy, the outcome funders won't finance it. If it's too challenging, almost impossible, investors won't take it. I think we were able to find a middle point where we said, okay, this is good value for money for both investors and the outcome funders. Now to your question about the 20%, I think it was done by design to encourage investors from day one to focus on jobs. Actually, it's a game changer in terms of discussion, because I worked in education and employment projects for 15 years before joining this project. And the question is always about how many people can we train, on what can we train them, what's your burn rate? In grants, how much can you spend? Because you're spending this year's money to get next year's money. And believe me, we are really, really advanced as a state in responding to burn rate requests from donors. This new design has forced everyone, especially service providers and investors, to think of the end result, the jobs. And it changes the conversation. And this is why many of the service providers we talked to, and even the investors, before having these 4 investors, we were doing scouting for investors. We went through tons of them. Nobody would agree. Even when we told them, let's do CSR, they said, we'll expense it as CSR, but we won't do an investment because it's too risky from a reputational standpoint. Now, the service providers even withdrew. They wouldn't even agree to go into a results-based contract. Now, we have been lucky with our investors, our outcome funders and service providers, because there was a common interest. So the 2080 was a welcome challenge. But again, this is only for the investors. To the service providers, it was the opposite. So we have shielded them from too much risk.
Louise, you had something?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on this broader point about risk and risk management within some of these contracts, and also particularly within some of these contexts where potentially the sort of formal legal enforceability is perceived to be less than maybe it would be in less fragile contexts in terms of sort of rule of law or ability to contest a contract with a third party. And I think one of the things, and I'm absolutely certain this is central to what both of you are doing, but I don't think we've really touched on today, is the importance of governance, and governance not just as a crisis resolution mechanism, not just as something that you go to at the point where something's gone wrong or something massive has changed in terms of your assumptions, but actually governance in terms of multi-stakeholder conversations, relationship building, cooperation, collaboration that works as part of the business as normal structure of delivering these contracts. And I wonder if that's the extent to which you feel that affected stakeholder perception of risk.
Tough one. So you mentioned, I think the key point in your question is changing assumptions. So we didn't know what was a good success rate to begin with, because everything is about expectations. And when we did the first assessment, the local employment programs were saying, oh, we have 70 or 80% job placement rates. If you do, why do we have unemployment? So I think we had to do our own due diligence and convince the stakeholders that we have to start being realistic. Some of these assumptions that, or some of these claims are not real. You have to dig deep, and this is why the F4J impact bond is so data rich. We have a board that represents the investors, and Anthony thus is on the board. They see the data rich information about our performance on a monthly basis. You cannot wait 3 months or 6 months or 1 year as other employment programs do. So I think you must have the right, not just the right ingredients and herbs, you need to have the right stakeholders who share the realistic viewpoint. Otherwise, you will just disappoint from the get-go.
Can I go to another question? Is that
Yeah,
okay?
yeah, it's okay. I'll add my points.
Okay, perfect. So why don't we take 2 here so we can maybe get through a couple. So yeah, to the lady right next to you, Matthias first.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the session. It's really, really interesting and enlightening. I'm an education advisor with the FCDO, and I'm based in Ghana, where we are funding an education outcomes fund program. And I have kind of 2 questions, if I may. The first one is, how do you deal with differences in, or have dealt with differences in service providers and the quality of what is delivered, but also the differences in technical approaches that are delivered? That's specifically relevant in education, and not so much how that is in health, but maybe for skills it's kind of similar. How have you managed that? Specifically, how have you maybe supported service providers that were particularly successful to move into different districts or other areas? Was that part of the programs that you were working on? And then secondly, how have you approached being like truly inclusive and thinking through leaving no one behind and really focusing on more marginalized, more vulnerable communities in the wider community you would work in or with? I think you talked about specific targets for women, for example, or premiums. But I'm particularly interested how you do that, because, for example, in education, if you want to improve learning outcomes, it's easier to do that for, let's say, an average child and not the child that has potential disabilities. So how do you deal with this in program design, and how specific, from your experience, do you need to be about this, and any advice on approaches to do that? Thanks.
Should we take another question as well, just so we have a few options? So the gentleman in the t-shirt, yeah.
You have to remind us of the question.
Yeah, sure.
Shukran Jidan Lia Amaluka. My name's Peter. I was based originally in refugee camps, working with NGOs in Iraq and Lebanon, spent some time in Syria, been across the whole Middle East. I got really annoyed with the inefficient corruption that I saw in local NGOs. And so my question, then I became an entrepreneur. My question is, in this system, how do you deal in complex environments? From what I've understood, you always have to adapt and things always break. And so it requires a lot of flexibility and adaptability on the ground and to allow local innovation. And I've seen that fail in multiple projects, but I'm guessing if you've been successful in your work here, that you've managed to build a system that at least has some ability to adapt and encourage innovation on the ground, on the bottom up level for those actually implementing it. So I'd love to hear what you've seen in the successes and also the failures and where those differentiators are.
Thanks so much. So you don't feel that you need to answer all 3, you can kind of pick, but we've got, so managing the differences in providers, inclusivity, leaving no one behind, making sure the service is truly inclusive, and then the last question about adaptations on the ground in response to rapidly changing circumstances. So Diva, I'll pass straight to you. You can pick your favorite.
I can start with service providers question, and then maybe I can ask Benjamin and Bashir to add as well, because they have that perspective more boldly. In terms of service providers, there are huge differences as well, as you might understand. We were covering 30 million of population, so the capacities were different. What was more interesting is prioritization for in the context of Afghanistan geographically. We were able to harmonize, first of all, standards were well defined. Performance of service providers would be carried out every 6 months. So we had a baseline in terms of who is doing a better job and who is not delivering, and that would help feedback. That would give us feedback into next contract cycle as well, because you would obviously know who is doing a better job and who is not doing a better job when you have standards. And we also pushed a lot for economy of scale. We did not want to manage with too many contractors as a government because we felt that we don't have that much capacity to do small contracts here and there. It was much easier to manage larger contracts that could be oversighted, and NGOs were encouraged to scale their capacity at least by one province. So we would just manage 22 contracts. Maybe Bashir and Benjamin, if you want to add anything on this question.
So it was really interesting to me. I remember way back when, early 2000s, when this was being discussed at the World Bank. And I think there were a lot of people who were very skeptical in the bank about the availability of capacity within the NGOs, really very skeptical. And I think one of the things that has really struck me is that without a lot of investment in what everybody calls capacity building for the NGOs, I think their capacity greatly improved over time. And I think this was a point that Bashir was making earlier. Partly, this was a function of competition, that if you wanted to win a contract, you really had to up your game. You had to really get better at what you do. And so I think that was an important, aspect of it. Another thing, and I think this gets to another question, is about providing the NGOs with sufficient autonomy. And that was a constant struggle because people in particular the Auditor General or other parts of the government, they really wanted to make sure that every penny was being used appropriately. And I mean, they wanted to create line item budgets. That's they were dying to do that. And some of the donors also, they wanted line items. And it was a real fight to preserve the autonomy of the NGOs. And I think the Sehat Mandi and the P4P, pay for performance, actually helped us that way because it sort of said, look, we're paying for results, we're not paying for the inputs, therefore line items are less important. So I think, guaranteeing and guarding the autonomy of NGOs is actually an important aspect of contract design and contract implementation. What do you think, Bashir?
Thank you, Benjamin. I completely agree with you. I think just to add on this, and I think there was a question mentioning about the quality. It also depends, I think, when we define quality and if we embed that in the results that we are expecting in the contracts. I think that the NGOs or the service providers will respond very good at it. But if the quality is not well defined and everyone thinks differently, I think that makes a problem because the service providers respond directly to the contracts and the languages that the contract management is designed. So I think just the lesson learned from us for us was that if we want the quality to be embedded, it should be in the design. It should be in the contract language. It should be in the results that we are paying for everywhere. And then I think that the service providers will adapt themselves, as Benjamin said, to the competition to provide you with the best quality that they can do and they can offer. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Jalil. Would you like to come in, perhaps on picking up on the inclusivity question as well?
Yeah. So first of all, not all our service providers succeeded. I mean, because there are different benchmarks. Employing or helping youth in carpentry is different from people, nurses and doctors. So we're managing very diverse, different portfolio. Some of them succeeded, some of them did not. And to diversify, we have 9 service providers, even though the project is very, very small. And we have over 14 or 15 subcontracts. So the ones that were successful, they were renewed. And this is where the inclusivity also comes in. The more successful, the more challenging you're trying to be. So we went at the beginning, when COVID hit, we went to the nurses and the doctors, and then we started going to less or more marginalized youth. We went into technical and vocational education, trying to serve more marginalized people. near the separation wall in what is called the Area C, especially women. And this is when we introduced the upholstery program, for example. And less performing service providers had to go through what we coined or termed performance improvement processes. So at least two of our projects went through performance improvement processes because they weren't delivering job results. They were delivering training results, obviously. It's easy to deliver training, but the board and our partners are looking on a monthly basis on conversion rates, success rates, and you must, and this is how you ensure inclusivity very quickly, through co-design between the World Bank and the investors and the service providers. They keep pushing us to go after the harder to serve population, to pick the more difficult youth to serve.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just reflecting. I think these are really important questions, and I think that differences in quality, enabling frontline adaptation, ensuring you reach the hardest to work with. These are all sort of different sides of the same problem in some ways. And I think in addition to the fun stuff that I get to think about with Harry, my day job is that I'm a practitioner in this space. So I help to design these contracts, to help think through the contract terms, to help think through what's needed to deliver. And I think the piece that we tend to see service providers need the most support with is that actually giving them contractual autonomy is necessary in terms of how to deliver the services, but actually it very often isn't sufficient. Because particularly if they've never had that autonomy before and are much more used culturally to managing to very tightly defined budgets, very little ability to move activities or to change money between budget lines, then actually that isn't necessarily something, that adaptation isn't necessarily something that their management teams really understand how to do. And very often their data systems are set up to report at the end of each year or report at the end of a 3-year program. They're not set up to inform monthly governance meetings or weekly team meetings, to really enable the teams to see who are we working with, where are our services effective, who are the people that aren't being served, what could we be doing differently, and to have those conversations. So I think there is a cultural shift, and that piece is the piece that we often find service providers need the support with, actually, is both shifting the data systems or indeed how they're just using the data they already have to drive management decisions such that they can take advantage of the autonomy that's in the contract. I don't know if that resonates.
That's great. Thanks, Louise. So we are in fact at time now. So sorry we didn't get to all the questions. Perhaps you can come and speak to the panelists afterwards. So coming up next, we've got a panel, a big picture panel. That's right. So that everyone will be back in the lecture theatre 1. That's at 4:15, and it's on formal relational contracting. But of course, we have to end by acknowledging our panelists, because it's been fantastic to hear your insight. It's been great to connect the sort of the big overarching themes of resilience, management of risk, support for government, but to bring it right down to what are the design decisions you've actually been making in your programs. I think that's one of the benefits of the conference as a whole. So thanks so much for what you've been doing.